Okay, thank you very much for coming out. Ready. Full stop. Welcome, Nick Montfort. Question mark. Syntax error. Ready. Full stop. 10 print. Open quotation marks. Welcome, Nick Montfort. Close quotation marks. Semicolon. 20. Go to 10. Run. Welcome, Nick Montfort. 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 Please join me in extending a very warm Yorkshire welcome to Professor Nick Montfort.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, and I appreciate the potentially infinite introduction. My talk today is about infinite verse in theory, but also because there are various forms of infinite verse that exist, it's about this type of verse in practice. I'm going to theoretically describe several types of infinite verse, the first of which does not even have to be digital or computational. And as I develop a typology of this sort of work, I'll explain how several poetic works are infinite in different ways. So this will involve my presenting and reading from some of my own work, but also making reference to other examples, in some cases, some of which go beyond literary art. Now, to begin with, I should get right into the concept of infinity, which is sometimes very off-putting, certainly for people who are not mathematically inclined or who are not mathematicians. One way to think about the word infinite with its origins in Latin is that it can be restated in English through a different etymology as boundless. And we know of things in our material existence that are boundless. The world is round, as Gertrude Stein wrote, and you can go on it, around and around. The surface of the spherical earth is unbounded. There's no limit to how far east one can go. That is imposed by the earth, for instance, as opposed to being limited by the cost of air travel or the human lifespan. So to have a rich discussion today, there's no need for me to go beyond what mathematicians call the potential infinite, boundlessness of this sort, or to discuss infinities that lie beyond countable infinities. So there's many more things to say about infinity, but what I'm going to cover today deals with perhaps the simplest formulation of what infinity is, and yet still offers us many opportunities for rich discussion. A ring of the sort that's worn on a finger is round, leading to interpretations of wedding bands as representing eternal love. There's a more recent trend of the infinity ring, which shows that people do not recognize infinity when it's already right there on their hand in the form of a circle, and that some would rather complicate and confuse a straightforward notion of infinity with additional symbolic baggage, ironically placing a symbol on the ring that serves as a boundary upon an object that would otherwise be boundless. Roundabouts are round and boundless in the sense of having no limit. They are infinite, and you can trace them around and around, or drive on them around and around. If your car's power source is exhausted after a while, this deficiency in your automobile hardly presents any challenge to the inherent boundlessness of the roundabout. Bertrand Russell made the distinction between a logical impossibility, such as putting two sets of different cardinalities into correspondence with each other, and those tasks he called only medically impossible. For a person to pronounce all the natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, is only medically, not logically, impossible. A person cannot circle a roundabout an infinite number of times only due to this sort of medical impossibility. Bertrand Russell could explain it to you himself much better, but that happens to be medically impossible. My focus is on infinite verse today, and of course by verse I mean lineated language. Poetry which, when composed, is turned by the poet into lines, the verses, in some typical or unconventional way, like a plow turning to create furrows. Language which is somehow metered or measured, even if not per line, can still be usefully regarded as verse in many cases. And then verse can mean a larger unit than a line. A verse is often used interchangeably with stanza. In song lyrics and in rap, there are verses that occur between repetitions of a chorus or hook. It's possible that a verse can correspond to much smaller units also. So George Starbuck's poems in hemimeter, half feet, have only a single syllable on each line, one-syllable verses. Lexically, the standard sort of palindrome has individual letters as the units of language it turns back on. So its units for the type of verse that it is would be individual characters or letters. Works of infinite verse, segmented verbal works that are boundless, do not need to be digital. There are many infinite artworks that are not based on digital computation or even what people would usually describe as technology, while there are many finite or bounded artworks that are computational. Some of the works that I'll cover are thought of as prose fictions, but I find that in many cases at least one turn of the sort that is characteristic of verse is present. For instance, in the very simplest case, the turn that connects the end of the language loop to the beginning. With reference to some work in sound and visual art, I'll explore several types of ultimately quite understandable infinite verse. First of all, simple loops. Secondly, loops that go through generated forms of language. Third, sequences of verse, and this is a mapping between digits, for instance, and language, which could be applied to finite sequences, but can also be applied to infinite sequences. And then finally, fractal and endlessly self-similar verse. So to begin with simple loops, I should mention also that my discussion has most of its examples actually in the first two of these categories, simply because there are fewer examples in the last two, which I find provocative for those seeking to explore infinite poetics. There's many opportunities in those last two categories that have not been taken advantage of as yet. So when I talk about simple loops, I don't mean to provide any value judgment here to say that a loop's simplicity is a bad thing. It is the loop itself in this case, and not particularly the language, that I mean is simple in terms of the infinite verse that I'm discussing. If the language is itself simple, that simplicity may be poetically appropriate. So simple is a description that's not meant to pass any judgment. There are plenty of examples in sound art of simple loops, not durational sounds or music works that were produced using tape loops. We know of some of these, such as Come Out to Show Them by Steve Reich, but works that exist in the form of boundless tape loops. They are materially boundless tape loops, such as the short 2-track cassette work here by Michael Ridge. It's worth noticing that an infinite artwork of this sort can be used to produce finite art, just as a finite length of magnetic tape can be connected end to end to create a boundless loop. I've selected this art piece as an example, however, because the work itself is a loop. It is distributed materially as a cassette tape with 7 seconds of tape spliced into a loop. The loop is not an intermediate element of producing a finite track. It is the sound art work itself. Of course, handmade works by artists such as this one aren't the only sort of endless tapes. The 8-track format, which was widespread in the US through the early 1970s, was also a much longer tape loop. And there are tapes for tape-based answering machines that were arranged in loops. What can be done with magnetic tape can be done with paper tape. The loop of computer code punched out of paper tape is indeed the literal and material form of the loop in flow control, in computer programming. When we speak of setting up a loop or a program running a loop, it is because of this sort of material instantiation of the loop. This is a concretely infinite system, infinite in time, potentially infinite in time. While the Turing machine is an abstract computer, without a bound on how large a program can be or what can be computed, any concrete instance of it will be bounded in space. With the use of a simple loop like this, however, a computer's process need not be bounded in time. Not logically bounded in time, only medically bounded in time, only because there will be wear on this material system. We need not consider specially coded paper loops to find infinities. The reader is asked to construct a loop when encountering John Barth's frame tale. Specifically, the reader is instructed to cut out this rectangle printed on both sides and assemble it into a Moebius strip. This is an unusual looking and topologically intriguing form with a single surface, but from the standpoint of the text still connects to itself in a simple loop. It does not have to be placed on an unusual surface. It could appear on one side of a simple paper ring, for instance, although in that case, the other side would be blank. So at best, John Barth was being environmentally sensitive by asking that a single-sided surface be constructed in which that single side is fully covered with text. A similarly clever and earlier boundless text by Tony Conrad shows that cutting and taping is not necessary at all to create a loop of language. It can simply be written on a sheet of paper like this. And we don't need to look to print, to writing, or to literary culture at all to find works that are infinite. There's an older work of orature that provides an example of a simple loop, just as clever as those by Barth and Conrad, with the same sort of meta-reference in its structure. The following is a well-known children's chant. Pete and Repeat were sitting on a fence. Pete fell off. Who was left? Pete and Repeat were sitting on a fence. Pete fell off. Who was left? Repeat. This chant was given art world status by virtue of its inclusion in Bruce Naumann's video installation, Clown Torture. The clown repeating this in Naumann's video installation seems tortured by the endlessness of the language, which has its verse-like turn after the answer to who was left, repeat. Children, however, delight in this infinity. They're not tortured by it because it's a systematic way to elicit more language, to keep a giddy language game going. Just as children delight in asking why in response to every answer they're given to the question why, not because they're philosophers, but because they have learned that the simple style of interrogation is a way to continually elicit more language from adults. They are pleased to find that repeat is a consequence of Pete's falling off the fence, and that it has its own consequence, the repetition of the verse. Repeat can be put together again and again after he falls off the wall, just as Humpty Dumpty, of course, cannot be. Which brings us to another folkloric figure who falls and rises, Tim Finnegan of the traditional song, who falls drunken from a height, as Elpenor does in the Odyssey. The Irishman falls with less fatal consequences than the young member of Odysseus' crew, as it turns out. Finnegan, presumed dead, is taken and laid out for his final festivities, but wakes at his wake, leading us to what is probably the most linguistically complex loop of language that is still essentially a simple loop, the nocturnal cycle of James Joyce's book, Finnegan's Wake, which has the same title as the traditional song when pronounced, but which differs by one character in print, lacking the apostrophe. It is fraught to speak of Finnegan's Wake beginning on the first page, page 1, and ending on the last page, page 628, whether one considers the book cognitively and experientially, or whether one considers it formally and materially, as language laid out in print. At the top of page 1 is the second half of a sentence, beginning, river run, past Eve and Adams. At the bottom of page 628, lacking any final punctuation, is what is evidently the first half of a sentence, alone, a last, a loved, along the. Consider then Finnegan's Wake as a verse work with its turn at this point. After the the word the with no punctuation, and before river run, placing tremendous emphasis on the last word of this very long line of verse, the, which also contrasts to the indefinite articles in alone, a last, a loved, a long. There is only one river run. Now, to put this Humpty Dumpty back together again, sunny side up, we read a single sentence. Away, alone, a last, a loved, along the river run. Past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. A sentence obviously about returns, cycles of water and history and myth, which conducts our return to the beginning of the book. But we are treating it as if it were not verse, and as if the sentence boundary was important. The exhortation is to read the whole verse, the whole book, again. Wash, rinse, repeat. Before continuing to more complex sorts of infinite verse, I will present the code to a very simple Apple II program that one software engineer reports typing in as his first programming experience. 10 print, I can beep. 20, print char string 7. 30, go to 10. This is a simple bit of infinite verse. Now, I make no claims about its literary value, but to loop back to the tape loops I considered earlier, it is also an infinite sound work because the second line uses the bell character to produce a beeping sound. It suffices to show that simple loops of language can be produced on a computer as well. This looping may be annoying for a listener and may seem banal for those who did not learn something about programming by typing this program in. Nevertheless, understanding how loops of code work can lead to poetic as well as technical insights. Stephanie Strickland and Cynthia Lawson-Jaramillo explain, cycles of actions, like loops in coding, create certain patterns that are often easily identifiable. And this is the case with non-programmed and generative art, like Solowitz wall drawings. Code-based generative art can run infinitely, allowing a viewer-reader to find those patterns, cycles, or loops. So having noted that the pure and simple repetition of language is possible, and not uninteresting always, with or without computers, we can now examine how computing allows for more varied generation of endless verse. Before I move to discuss some older and more established literary examples, let me reintroduce the one-line program, 10 print char string 205.5 plus rand 1 go to 10, for the Commodore 64 and other Commodore computers, which simply produces a character at a time, each the result of a coin flip, either a left-leaning or right-leaning diagonal line. And the book cover here, from a book that I wrote with 9 others about this program, gives the pattern that is produced when this program is run. The result, when it's wrapped around into 2 dimensions, as happens on the screen, is what I find a very compelling sort of maze-like pattern, continuing without bound. If we think of this as a sort of concrete poem, or at least a visual poem, it's made out of characters, it's built out of a typographical system, I would say it's perhaps the minimal example of a literary work that loops without bound, but is not a simple loop of language. A still fairly simple, but interesting text generator was developed originally in German by Theo Lutz in 1959, and this was his stochastic texts. I have it up here for reference, but let me actually bring a working version of this system before you. pieces of mine that I'm going to refer to are all available to you at nickim.com. And among the things that I'm talking about are some pieces that I have re-implemented, some classic text generators, including stochastic text, and they are on this subsite here called Memory Slam. That may sound violent, but it was written for the first Code Poetry Slam at New York University. I was invited to come there, be one of the judges, and on the train down, I put the first of these together as a historical contribution. So stochastic text, the way that I've put it together, I should mention, this does not represent how it materially manifested itself back in 1959. Back in 1959, it looked like this, materially. For one thing, it was in German, but for another thing, it was printed out on a teleprinter. What I meant to do was to create a version that is formally similar to what was provided by the original program. It works the same way, and it produces sentences like these. No farmer is good, and a tower is strong. Every house is good. A picture is large. Every table is far. Therefore, not every house is near. A laborer is far. No village is angry. Not every farmer is strong. Not every farmer is free. Every way is far. No way is quiet. Not every tower is strong, and every way is open. My implementation here allows you to just look at the underlying code, which is fairly short here in JavaScript, and get access to the process that's being used to put these sentences together. You can also see even simpler code that's available to you that does the same thing, but is in Python. And as the license at the top says, you're welcome to study and modify this to create your own stochastic text-based system. It's really a fairly simple process, as you probably don't even need to look at the code to figure out. It's generating these curious statements, these propositions that seem sort of logically inspired. They seem sort of detached with an unusual logical style syntax, and yet they draw from the vocabulary of Franz Kafka's The Castle. And so to me, this is very effective as a work because it's not simply an interesting lexicon. It's not simply that the language of this is Kafkaesque, but the syntax and the way it's assembled is as well. And so this is a looping process, and even when it was presented on a teleprinter, it was still a looping process. It was boundless. You could produce as many of these sentences as you wanted. And this is the type of process that is different at every step rather than being the same. It's based on randomness or pseudo-randomness, and it's generative. Let's see here. And I'll switch back and tell you about the next piece I want to discuss. So this is a piece of mine from 2016, which I'll put up and tell you about. And again, the essence of it, and the first Python version I did, was very, very similar to the way that stochastic text worked in terms of producing a different sort of headline-like sentence at every step. The essence of it, again, is looping, and within that, a different formulation of the same grammatical possibility at each step. And Autopia is available at nickim.com as well. It's It's right underneath Memory Slam, it happens to be. Noble New Yorkers caravan. Prefects focus premier javelin. Pilot accents robin. Wrangler acclaims brat. Rangers probe phantom aviators. Phantom Navajos. Safari. Kitten aspires. Roadmaster's quest. Maxima fit matrix axiom. Cavalier defender quests. Reliant skyhawk escapes. Courier focuses. Hombres accent. Firebird. Defenders rally. Ranger golfs. So what's going on in this immense roadway here? Well, that's up to you as listeners and readers. But what's going on underneath this in the computer program is that there's a semantic grammar that produces each of these headline-like narratives, these very brief, curt and incomplete, sort of telegram-like statements. And they're made entirely out of the singular and plural names of automobiles. There are no other lexemes here, no other parts of speech, no other words except for these. And in developing this piece, one thing that I found interesting about it is that traffic is one of these things that we have the subjective experience of it being endless, of it being infinite, of it going on. We can, even if we take a top-down objective view, we can think of cars as going by continually. And so it matches the concept and idea of infinity, of boundlessness, of potential infinity, just as the roundabout can be driven around any number of times. As I was working on this, I also found that there were some very curious things about the way that cars were named. So cars in North America are often named like Suburban Comanche Focuses, Dakota Lasers, Azure Prefect. Cars in North America are often named after native peoples. They're named after after horses that some of which were of course displaced by the automobile. They're named after European explorers, the forester, the voyager, the explorer, the villager, the mountaineer. And so sometimes when you put these words together, they happen to narrate conflicts between native peoples and Europeans in the United States. There's also differences of class, so you get things like New Yorker Golfs, because there's a car named the New Yorker and there's a Volkswagen named the Golf, and various other sort of unusual connections that give voice to different narratives that I certainly wouldn't have thought up on my own, and I never did think up on my own. This particular grammar and the lexicon of corporate naming developed these for me. Envoy, courier's passport. Imperial troopers, focus. Brats ram suburban Dakotas. Cavalier Broncos, aspire. Noble proteges, acclaim premier prowlers. Raider acclaims cougars. New Yorker's Club Wagon. I would hate to be in that wagon. Matador focuses. Prelude expresses pilot. Uplander quests. Premier aviator golfs. So that's a bit from Autopia. Autopia has 3 manifestations. It's written in this web version, and it's written in Python as well. But it also manifests itself, besides being on the web, as a gallery installation and as a book published by TrollThread of 256 pages. I want to mention some other loops of generated language. A very famous one in the US is by the Fluxus artist Alison Knowles in collaboration with composer James Tenney, A House of Dust. And here I've shown you one of its material forms. It's published as a sort of chapbook, although it's just computer paper output here. A House of Dust is a computer program that Alison Knowles wrote in Fortran that generates 4-line stanzas, quatrains, each of which have very noticeable regularity, but also types of variation. And I'll show you House of Dust, and I'll also show you a piece that I made from it using a very simple technique called erasure, in which I use the same underlying system, the same basic generating algorithm, but I simply have removed certain letters from the original text. And so this is House of Dust and then Use of Dust. All right, so let's take a look at, well, first of all, I'll show you House of Dust, and I'll read at least a few stanzas from that. This is a 1967 piece, and it's, although, of course, I think stochastic text, there doesn't seem to be any reason why that wouldn't count as poetry. A House of Dust is often considered one of the first, or the first computer poems. It is shaped into stanzas, and they're stanzas like this. A house of wood under water, using natural light, inhabited by people speaking many languages, wearing little or no clothing. A house of plastic among other houses, using candles, inhabited by friends. A house of dust in southern France, using candles, inhabited by people who enjoy eating together. One of the things I should point out about digital literature and this type of production of generated language is that in a very direct, simple, and material sense, it challenges us to figure out new ways to read. Let me make that clear in perhaps the most simple and obvious way possible. If you wanted to read this poem, I suspect, being a reader of English, that your eyes would move to the upper left-hand corner of the page, where, for instance, right now it says, A House of Roots. But by the time I finish saying A House of Roots, that stanza has already scrolled off. It's gone. So you need to actually think of a different way of reading this if you are to succeed at reading it. Of course, you could throw up your hands and say, that's impossible. Let me mention the other way that you could think to read this is if you were to start up in the upper left and read a house of plastic among other houses, and then the next stanza were to come up, you could just continue reading that stanza where it is. Using candles, inhabited by horses and birds, right? It turns out that these lines, once you understand, either from the outside or from the inside, once you understand the way that this poem is assembling its language, you see that the lines are independent of one another. And so if you wanted to, you could just plow on through and read line by line in this other way. I'm going to show you use of dust. And so use of dust is the same thing that you just saw, except that certain letters have been removed. It's just an erasure of the generated poem by Alison Knowles and James Tinney. And in fact, if I press Control A to highlight everything, you can see that underneath your view of the screen, the original House of Dust is still there. So there's House of Dust, and this is use of dust. Use of tin. I ate. Sing all by horses and birds. Use of one in desert air. Sing a light by friends. Use of okay, I ate. Sing city by friends and enemies. Use of eaves in dins. Sing by people of life. Use of tin by the sea. Sing a light by collectors of all types. Use of scar clot. Outran. Sing a light by vegetarians. Use of eel on land. Sing all by very tall people. So erasure is a way that's popular both in the visual arts and in poetry and writing of making a new work simply by removing or covering up or effacing things from earlier works. And it can be applied to generated language in the same way that it might be applied to a more standard or conventional material text. All right. Let's see here. All right. So here's use of dust. And then beyond what I've shown you, there's a broader idea of the main loop, as in a game or other interactive program, which allows for repeated input and response to this input. As Strickland and Jeremio write, relevant to their slipping glimpse that you see here, a program written for microcontroller may warn against infinite loops. However, for an interactive art installation, it is important for a machine to be continually, infinitely listening for interactions, which the piece will then respond to. It is the infinite loop that makes the machine able to react to human choice and to movement unpredictable in either space or time. So this point makes it clear that not just the one-line basic program beginning tin print, that Commodore 64 program I showed you earlier, but in fact, the environment that the Commodore 64 provides on startup, in which you get to type basic commands, you get to write programs, you get to type system commands, that itself is an infinite looping program. This environment loops, always ready to accept keyboard input and continually checking the contents of the keyboard buffer. And so along those lines, one of the earlier significant computer literary works that is infinite or boundless is Joseph Weizenbaum's Eliza, and specifically the doctor script written for Eliza, recognized as the first chatbot. And this is actually, again, the material way in which this would appear. This is a typeset version, actually, not a teleprinter output. But it would manifest itself on ink and paper, and people would respond using a teletypewriter or similar sort of interface in order to converse with Eliza. The fact that this conversation wasn't bounded also qualifies it as a type of infinite literary art. So interactivity, though, is just one option that an endless loop provides. In the realm of visual art, Ian Cheng's live simulations involving 3D graphics and sound run without user input in continual generative loops. Literary loops with varying outputs can also be interactive or not. And even if they're not interactive, they can still be live in this sense. So interactivity is a possibility for computer work, but it's not required. And similarly, multimedia is a possibility, but you can also produce text by itself. And furthermore, the things that we're looking at here often involve either interactivity or randomness, but randomness is not something that's obligatory when you create a computer work. One of the pieces of generated language that I developed, Taroko Gorge, a one-page program initially, has taken on a boundless life of its own in a different way. And so I want to read from a little bit of Taroko Gorge and tell you where it's gone since I wrote this original program back in 2009. Height trails the veins. Veins relax. Mists exercise the coves. Track the straight-driven. Brow commands the basin. Shapes linger. The crag roams the rocks. Progress through the arched, cool, driven. Forest paces the basins. Basins dream. Basins hum. Height paces the coves. Shade the encompassing, rough, clear. The crag frames the rippling. Mist exercises the rocks. Run the encompassing, cool. Stone exercises the ripplings. Ripplings rest. The crag trails the vein. Translate the arched, clear. Mists roam the vein. Layers roam the basins. Shade the cool. So this is a text generator. This is an endless loop of language, which I can actually display to you rather than keeping it secret on my computer. And in writing it, so first of all, I wrote it at Taroko Gorge National Park in Taiwan, in the tradition of Western people coming and writing poetry about scenes of natural beauty. It's a sort of Gary Snyder-esque type of poem, but I thought if somebody can come and do that as a poet, why can't I do that as a poet programmer? Why can't I write a program that generates poetry of a similar sort? And so this is quite a conservative type of textual output compared to what I normally write. It's pretty legible. It can more or less be read and understood. It's giving a representation of what it is like to walk through Taroko Gorge, to stop at various viewing stations. The lines that end in dashes there are meant to represent the experiences of going through the tunnels that Chiang Kai-shek had his nationalist army carve when they needed something to do after they went to Taiwan. Taroko Gorge was put together with that in mind, and it defines a type of, I wouldn't say stanza form, but a type of strophe form. So there there's going to be these tunnel lines or cave lines representing going through the mountains, and then the longer strophes begin and end with lines related to walking and seeing different things that are above and below. And in between these lines will be 0 or more lines related to something static, stopping and looking at things from a point of where you can view. Veins hum, veins hold. Here there are none of these intermediate lines. Heights linger. So they're slightly more dynamic, but slowly moving lines with one or more slightly more static lines in between. And this is a type of form that I developed. Well, what happened, interestingly enough, so this itself is an endless text, a boundless text, an infinite text. What happened, interestingly enough, is that others, including, to begin with, Scott Retberg, developed their own versions of Taroko Gorge, or better yet, they took the Taroko Gorge code and they made their own original projects with them. So whereas I had written about a place of natural beauty that I actually went to, Scott Retberg chose to write about an urban landscape that he had never been to and that existed only in his feverish Western imagination. And he put every stereotype about Tokyo that he could imagine, and he's a very fictive individual, so he has many of them. He put every stereotype about Tokyo into this piece, Tokyo Garage. Godzilla jams the shadows, funds rock, no enthusiasts subdue the freak, translate the curvy comic, poets deceive the subject, processors dwell, neon signs dwell, saxophonist loves the Rocketeers, concatenate the welcome, awkwardly familiar, endless, scholars orient the subway, mute rearranges the sailors. So here, he's taken the same form. It still has strophes of the same sort. It still has the sort of cave lines or tunnel lines that I defined, but he's completely changed out the vocabulary to make it about something different. And others did this as well. J.R. Carpenter did a piece which is about the endlessness, not of the pathways in a national park and not of wanderings around a city landscape, but the endlessness of disgusting forms of consumption of food. Sweat incises the slightest sliver, slight juliennes, the vinaigrettes, right the berry ginger, digestive juices tear the palms, taste buds soak, gullet swallows the tongue, and then this piece, rather than being called Taroko Gorge, is simply called Gorge, because it's about endless gorging. And so J.R. did some other pieces. There's Talon Mehmet's Toy Garbage. There's pieces by, Alone Engaged by Maria Ingberg is another one of these, which might take too long for us to load here, which is about a university experience and about sitting around and being amongst other people, but being alone. And then one of the interesting early pieces is that Andrew Plotkin did a piece that just as other people had remixed Taroko Gorge in various ways and made new versions, Andrew Plotkin did a remix of all the existing remixes. So on the left, you see the code from Taroko Gorge as he's transformed it, and on the right, you see his version of what that code does. It's not my original code. It's an altered version of my original code. Mark Sample's version, his generative poem is called Take George, after the Star Trek star. And so you see each of these being remixed at this higher level by Andrew Plotkin's code. And so this has gone on. There's now, there's some dozens that I know about, and there's also, it's often used as a class project. And so there's likely hundreds of different pieces, some of which are in Polish, and some of which are in other languages. And so when you develop a piece that is available as free and open source software, and it's simple enough for people to understand and engage with, you invite another type of boundlessness and infinity, which is that you're offering the work for continual, unlimited transformation. And so not only is this a generative system in that it produces line after line without bound, but the code itself can be transformed, and it's a generative system in that way. And it's a different type of infinity, not one of my main 4 types, in fact, that I've named there. All right. All right. So Taroko Gorge is my last example from this main 2 types of simple loops of language and loops of generated language. And the next to look at is sequences of verse. So one thing you can do as any type of artist is you can define a mapping from, for instance, let's say digits, so that each number maps to something else. Tony Conrad developed a sound piece called pi in 1978 by mapping the digits of pi. And here, this is an image of Francois Morellet's piece that was completed 2 decades before Conrad's in 1958. In this work, each quadrant of each canvas corresponds to a digit, specifically to a digit of pi. And the parity of the digit, whether it's even or odd, determines whether that quadrant will be black or white. An even digit means black, a white digit means odd. So to make this concrete, you see 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 9, 2, 6. Those are the first digits of pi. And so each quadrant is assigned a digit of pi. The first canvas corresponds to 3, 1, 4, 1. The odd number 3 means that the upper left will be white. The odd number 1 means the upper right will be white. The even number 4 means the lower left will be black. The odd number 1 means the lower right will be white. And that determines everything about this sequence of 6 canvases. It doesn't determine, of course, why Morellet stopped at 6. Which is another question, because obviously he could have gone on boundlessly. I also know of a visual artist, Katie Gilligan, who executed a painting in 10 colors, 10 different shades of green, each corresponding to a digit of pi. So my own poem, Round, of which you see just a piece, as you might expect, uses this very well-worn technique, developing a correspondence between digits and media elements, so that any sequence of digits can be mapped to a new sort of sequence. This isn't an inherently infinite way of producing a work, but if you use an infinite sequence, like the digits of pi, then it becomes that. So in Round, what I do is I do use pi. I compute pi using a spigot algorithm. And what I map the digits of pi to are strings to produce sequences of language. The only way Round differs from the previously discussed works is that it is a concretely unbounded poem. It's not just a finite selection. It employs this published spigot algorithm to produce the digits of pi one at a time limitlessly. And I'll read you from Round. That's the web version. And that's the Python version. It runs a little bit faster. But that's not the only difference. It's also possible to see the difference of the framework of the terminal window and the web page as being significant. So I'll read from the beginning of Round. Form intends intense verse, crease to tense form, tense vent verse, tone verse form, crease form, vent tends to crease to tens form, form, vent form, crease, tone, verse, tense. Crease, vent, vent, tens inverse tone into verse form, verse, verse form, tone, tense in. Tense, vent, crease. Verse, tone, tens, verse, tens, tens, tense, verse, crease, form, tone, vent into tens. To crease, vent, to crease. Vent, verse, verse, vent, to crease, vent. Form, tens, vent, crease, tense, form, tens, crease, in tone. To tone, verse, vent, crease, in tens, vent. Vent to tense, in form, crease, vent. Finitude, once again, rears its head. Instead of continuing on with this, I want to point out some things about round. You understand that, of course, if Morellet were to have painted another set of 6 paintings following the same rule, they would look alike in that the white and black quadrants would be the same. And similarly, every time this program is run, it produces the same text. This is a deterministic program. There's no randomness involved here. Just as the digits of pi are not random, they're a determined sequence. And yet, it's also a boundless or infinite poem. There is no last word of it. You can keep going at any point. So this might disturb some intuitions about what computing is and what randomness does in terms of its involvement. Here you have a boundless poem that is not random. And I'm going to conclude with the last of these sections. Let's see here, and tell you about a fractal work. All right. So fractal or self-similar verse is an intriguing area. Fractals were certainly a big deal in the 1980s. I don't know how many people remember this program, FractInt, which provided lots of printout decoration for dorm rooms in many cases. It's a program that allowed you to produce fractal images of this sort, to zoom without limit. And it's still maintained, it's still available, but it originally came out in 1988. And FractInt is considered a sort of a graphics toy. It's not really put forth as an artwork, but I think it's a very compelling piece of digital art. Another interesting project is Fractal Lab by Tom Bedard. And this is a system that allows for self-similar work such as this Minger sponge to be produced, to be seen at different angles, to be zoomed in on, again, offering views of particular spatial infinities. I find it interesting, though, if you look on the screen, that Tom Bedard, the developer, doesn't even put his name on this system. There's a URL at the bottom linking to his name, and then to many of these static images of fractals, and he calls those artworks. But this interactive program is framed more as a tool. It's not an artwork itself. And I think that's very interesting because to me this is more compelling as an artwork than some particular snapshot that one might make. In searching for infinitely zoomable fractal works of literary art, I located some intriguing short programs in C and Java that generate static ASCII renderings of the Mandelbrot set. They're impressive, but they don't allow interactive zooming. And so this program, you can see those first 3 lines are the computer program. That's the entire computer program. And when it's run, it produces the output down below by mathematically generating the Mandelbrot set. The one fractal work that I was able to find, I do not have one myself, is Finnish poet Marko Niemi's Midwinter Night's Dream. It's based on a 21st century poetic form and using the lexicon of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Specifically, it uses the original sequence of 6-letter words. That is a subsequence of the play's text. So all of the 6-letter words in Midsummer Night's Dream in order. This is one of 3 generators of heinaku posted on the poet's page, no later than early 2006. The heinaku is a simple to describe poetic form. It's a 3-line poem with 1 word on its first line, 2 words on its second line, and 3 words on its third line. The form was introduced by Eileen Tablos in 2003 with the name heinaku coined by Vince Gotera. The heinaku is a 3-line word-by-word analog of the Oulipian poetic form known as the snowball poem, in which each line has 1 additional letter. Although the form only requires a tercet of 1 word, 2 words, and 3 words, additional constraints may be imposed. And Niemi did impose additional constraints, obviously. They were related to the number of letters in each word. All of them are 6-letter words. The arrangement of the letters, they're arranged in these triangular configurations, and the shape of the stanza overall, and of course the source text coming from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And so this is a work that you can click and boundlessly or infinitely zoom in, where the word that is highlighted will become, the word that you click on will become the new highlighted word overall. And so you can move, although it's in discrete steps, you can move into this without bound. And Kaz Maslanka has computed the fractal dimension of this piece as being about 1.63. It has 6 self-similar pieces and a zooming factor of 3. So interestingly enough, I think fractals, both in visual art, but certainly in literary art, although they fired our imagination so much in the 1980s and 90s, they're very underexplored as a type of infinite literary art, as a type of infinite artwork. And I'm glad to have found at least this one example. But I think the opportunities are many more. And I think there's also many opportunities to produce boundless works in which mappings from an infinite sequence become something new. So these are the types of infinite verse that I've discussed. Simple loops of language, which aren't always that simple in terms of their literary qualities. Looping through generated language. Infinite sequences of verse, and the one example there in literary art is my work Round, although that concept is directly taken from Tony Conrad and Francois Morellet, among others. And then the fractal or self-similar verse, where Marko Niemi's is the example there. So with that, I want to conclude these parts of my comments. I'd be glad to talk some more about other pieces, including non-infinite pieces of my own poetic work, my own computational poetry. I can show or briefly read from other pieces, but I'd also be glad to talk about the theory as well as the practice of these sorts of works. Thanks very much.